Well, I graduated from high school, and naturally employment was at a very low level at that time. This was in the Depression of the 30s. And I wasn't particularly thrilled with the idea of leaving Minnesota, coming down to Virginia. However, it was a job opportunity.
Well, it's pretty tough for coming from the country on the farm and working on the ship, but that was what I needed to do and wanted to do, is to get a job.
I went from high school in 1934, September the 19th, and I made 38 cents an hour. And I saved $100 in that year. And my mother charged me $5 a week for renting room. And I went in as a machinist, apprentice. And then I made 42 cents an hour the second year, 52 cents an hour the third year, and the fourth year I made 64 cents an hour. I was in high cotton. Bought an automobile. Wasn't much, but I bought an automobile.
The entrance to the shipyard, probably still is, was on Washington Avenue, and you drove or walked through the gates there and came down a slight incline to get to the normal ground level, or let's say sea level almost. The main clinic was right on the left-hand side as you came down. The Navy building, which was about a three-story building, was just at the foot of the slope where the Navy had their offices to satisfy the Navy construction. And then on the right side, as you came down the hill, where your transportation vehicles were maintained. And then just beyond that was the apprentice school. And then beyond that, you get out into the main yard. And the north side had all the ways on it. The south side had all of the outfitting docks where the ship was moved for outfitting. The machine shops were mainly in between there. That's generally the layout. And they have what they call its declivity board. And that's a board made to equal the angle on which the ship is. So if you used a level, you get the right angle on whatever you were installing. When it's first starting and the keel is laid, you got a certain group of men that deal with the riveting of the plates and that sort of thing. And then as the ship is completed, you have other industries coming in for the machinery spaces and the passenger areas, you know, whatever type of labor it took to build that particular item. So from beginning to end, you've got almost a full gamut of types of labor in building a ship.
The shipwrights and the shipfitters work very closely together. The erectors, which were the ones that operated the cranes and things like that, naturally you had to use them because they had to do the lifting and the moving and put the things in place. And then the shipwrights and you or the riggers would set it, and then they'd bolt it in place, and later on, or tack weld it, whatever the case may be. And then later on, the welders would come in and the riveters would come in and finish it off. Now, working on the ship itself, where you had to use a burner to cut things off, a chipper to chip things off, you know, with a pneumatic hammer. They had them on the ship, and you go get him and bring him to where you were working, and he'd do the job for you.
I was a little bit worried about working on the hull, but they had the staging built and the framework, which made it protect you from falling, and it worked out fine.
Wind blow, you were standing on a stage board that was 12 inches wide over top of water, because the ship hung over the water. And the wind came down the James River. You couldn't put enough clothes on. But in the summertime, you're welcome to that breeze because it's pretty warm too. And the physical labor was pretty heavy. big bolts, big nuts, big wrenches, big hammers, big maws, putting on the propeller or the rudder.
And that was a job working on staging and down below 50 or 60 feet, for nothing below you. And if you dropped a hammer or Nick kicked something off the staging, boy, you were yelled at. Let me tell you, anybody working down there. But that's the kind of work you had to do. I've walked across a beam that wide, all the way across from one side to the other, just balancing myself and nothing below me. You took risks. Ocean didn't exist in those days.
A ship under construction is just a dirty place. It's no way you can keep it clean. Even though they have a cleanup crew, men that go through the ship, start from one end to the other, and when they finish, they start out all over again, just sweeping and gathering up debris.
Of course, the noise was bad. You had riveters overhead beside you, and chippers around you, and the stench was terrible, and the heat was terrible, the smoke, and you had to live through all that. It's something you accepted. It was part of life.
Machine shop, of course, you stood at a machine and you never sat. And you didn't do anything but run that machine.
On the main machine shop floor, they built the turbines for the ship and any other metal, steel appliances that were needed. The machine shop in those days machined a lot of the equipment that went on board the ship. They polished the propellers in there. They had huge machinery that did all of the machining. Lathes, planers, milling machines, you name it.
The ship fitting was mostly, you had your own 6-foot rule, and any tools you needed, you drew from the tool shop. Everything was riveted in those days. The welding didn't come in until during World War II, as far as finished welding I'm talking about. The riveting was cumbersome. The tradespeople were good at what they did. I think it was piecework. They got paid depending on the size of rivet, the type of rivet, where it was done.
The rivets are put in red hot, glowing red, and driven up, and then of course when they cool down they shrink, and that pulls the joint together even tighter. So a riveted joint is very strong, very tight.
The whites and the blacks, they had to work together in that sense of the word, but so far as being sociably and whatnot, and of course, the toilet facilities were entirely different down in the yard.
The sanitary facilities were not so good. They had a built pier off from the rudder, and you sat on a piece of 2x4, and that's where you did your business, right in the river.
It started off at 40 cents an hour, but in the Welland, we were pieceworking at the time, and that was the most money I ever made before, so I thought I was rich. Paid you so much a foot for your weld. Different welds paid different prices.
Payday was handled out in the yard behind the main office building, and they had a number of windows across the back side of the main office building where the different departments would line up to pick up their pay, and the pay was in cash. And every Friday, if you were up on Main Street, you'd see the armored cars going back and forth from the bank, bringing the cash into the shipyard to pay off the labor.
And they didn't pay on company time. You went to the pay window after the workday was over.
They paid you in cash, in an envelope, and anything less than $5 would be in silver dollars, 1 through 4.
We started out at first 40 hours, and then we went 35 hours. Mr. Roosevelt says we're going to cut down on the hours in order to get more people working.
The launching. It was always the focal point. You know, the launching would be the main thing that happened while in the ship's career while it was being built.
On the day of the launch, they put the grease on the ways, and the ship is lowered onto the ways by jacks.
The ship is built on the ways. It's supported by, we call them shores. They look like telephone poles. Poles, just a forest of them, supporting the ship up off the ways.
They would knock all the shores out, and that in itself is something. The riggers would do this. They'd volunteer, and they would have these big 12 by 12s with ropes, and they'd chant, and they'd knock the shores out. They were timed on either port and starboard side.
Once it starts to move, it goes. And out in the river, the tugs will pick it up, bring it around to the building docks.
It was, all the steel work was finished, all the hull and deck houses and things like that. But a lot of the electrical and the sheet metal work and the furniture and piping and all these things were done over on what we call the south side, which was the outfitting side of the yard. Ships had wooden decks over the steel in those days, and they had wooden hand railings on them. And the ship carpenters would do that. The joiners would do a lot of the furniture work, and would do a lot of the finished woodwork. They were more decorative, in other words. And the painters are on the south side. All the painting was done primarily after the ship was launched.
Sometimes they would open the ships to the public, particularly a passenger ship, and they were something to see. Very attractive. It's all the hard and dirty work that goes into making something that looks so pretty when it's finished.
I am Eric Sheriff. I live in York County in Dare, in the nicest place in York County.
So when I came down here, I was surprised at the shipyard, and I didn't know that much about shipbuilding. I didn't know anything about shipbuilding. However, Mr. Via seemed to be impressed and whatnot with my qualifications.
You well more. So it is, you work harder, and didn't loaf, you made more money.
What was the pay like when you started?
I think it was 36 cents an hour in the apprentice school. And you got regular raises every, say, 6 months or so. Maybe
How far did 36 cents an hour go?
Oh, in those days, it didn't do too badly.
But it wasn't bad. You didn't know what air conditioning was. The only thing was air conditioning in those days were restaurants and later on motion picture theaters. If you don't have it, you don't miss it. If you never had it, you don't miss it.
Normally it would go. I don't know if Newport News, I think we had 1 or 2 ships stick on the ways, but none that stuck there overnight, I don't think.